Reverend Creech. He is presenting something that I haven't heard him present before, but I know the material a little bit. The topic being human in a chaotic world, Wendell and societal regression. So I'm looking forward to where he has gone with this. Thank you.
Let me see if, okay. Well, I am not a scientist, and I take a great honor and privilege that Luis invited me to come and present this weekend. It is a real privilege to do so. But on the subject of being human, I'm going to bring some of the humanities to the table. But I think there's a lot of parallel to what we've talked about already today. In the second half of the 20th century, Dr. Murray Bowen introduced a new way of thinking about human behavior that understood the human as part of the natural order, neither separate from it nor biologically unique. He posited that the human response to our environment are rooted in reactions rooted deeply in our phylogenetic past, and that they are things we hold in common with all biological life. Eventually, he articulated a natural systems theory of human behavior comprising 8 interlocking principles or concepts. Bowen considered societal emotional process, the 8th concept, to be a distinctive of the Georgetown approach to family systems thinking. He also believed it to be about what he called the least understood concept of his theory. Bowen postulated that the same emotional processes observable in families were also at work in the larger emotional system of human society. Just as a human family could experience a downward spiral of regression given a high enough level of anxiety and a low enough level of emotional maturity, so could a human society. The processes, he contended, were identical. Bowen argued that from the late 1940s through 1972, society had regressed a full 10 points on his scale, or about 20%. He reached his conclusion without the benefit of the internet, deriving his claims from observations and personal knowledge of public officials in his local area, from following the national scene in newspapers, magazines, and literature, keeping file on landmark court decisions and cases in which there was enough information on the principal people involved to make what he called a valid estimation. Bowen based his assessment on issues known to influence regression in families and small social groups. He tried to exclude changes that he considered might have direct connection to the sweeping progressive change in society. He also attempted to exclude from his evaluation the polarized forces called liberal and conservative forces. The symptoms of regression Bowen identified included increases in violence, crime, drug use, divorce rates, and the sexual revolution in all of its expressions. He also observed a pronounced increase in focusing on rights rather than responsibilities, an increase in the togetherness forces operative in society in which decisions are made to allay the anxiety of the moment, and he saw an increase in cause and effect thinking. What generated the chronic anxiety resulting in this kind of regressive emotional reactivity in society? Bowen considered and eventually rejected several hypothetical sources, including the Vietnam War, which he came to believe was a symptom, not a primary source of the societal reactivity. As Bowen analyzed the current regression, he pointed instead to environmental sources for the underlying anxiety. It was not, he believed, generated by conflicts between and among human beings, such as war. Rather, he continued, the conflict between the human and nature lay at the root of the regression. He surmised, partly based on the work of John Calhoun, that an exploding human population with its attendant environmental impact was near the source of the problem. Human beings are instinctively aware that the resources to sustain life on Earth are limited, and that the rapidly increasing population may soon exhaust such things as arable land, clean water, and petroleum. At the same time, human beings notice the absence of new frontiers in which to spread and begin to feel more fenced in. Additionally, we begin to recognize that our ecosystem cannot indefinitely absorb the waste products of our unsustainable consumer-driven lifestyles. Constant threats to the planet through the elimination of large portions of rainforests, the extinction of hundreds of species, the spewing of nitrogen-based agricultural products into our waters, the atmospheric effects of the carbon-based lifestyles of developed nations are ignored by many. Denial of the threat at the conscious level does not fool the emotional system, however. The threat to our environment is perceived as a threat to our future and survival, and anxiety rises. Bowen believed that this growing disconnection between human beings and nature contributed to the chronic social anxiety expressed in a rising togetherness force and the resultant symptoms of the regression. Wendell Berry is an 82-year-old Kentucky farmer, an award-winning novelist, essayist, and poet whose philosophy is sometimes characterized as the new agrarianism. In 2012, Berry was honored by the National Endowment for the Humanities as the Jefferson Lecturer. Berry has for decades argued that an approach to human flourishing that can be achieved without damaging the natural world to which humans are necessarily and inextricably connected. Although Berry is well read, Dr. Murray Bowen's published papers do not appear to have found their way into his personal reading list. He has, however, articulated some common sense conclusions about human beings and our world that are akin to the observations made by Bowen. In addition, Berry has thought deeply about what a more harmonious relationship with nature might look like, and has spent decades attempting to live in that harmony and to communicate it to others. Berry's works could be helpful in thinking through what it would mean to become the kind of human who lives, in Bowen's words, in better harmony with nature. Wendell Berry's claim that we are living in a disintegrating society echoes Bowen's observation that our society is experiencing regression. Berry says, "Mostly we do not speak of our society as disintegrating. We would prefer not to call what we are experiencing social disintegration. But we are endlessly preoccupied with its symptoms: divorce, venereal disease, murder, rape, debt, bankruptcy, pornography, teenage pregnancy, fatherless children, motherless children, child suicide, public child care, retirement homes, nursing homes, toxic waste, soil loss, soil and water pollution, government secrecy, government lying, government crime, civil violence, drug abuse, sexual promiscuity, abortion as birth control, the explosion of garbage, hopeless poverty, unemployment, unearned wealth. We know the symptoms all too well. All the plagues of our time are symptoms of a general disintegration," he says. A forcible reintegration of our world by means of economic, military, educational centralization has not worked, although in our anxiety we've attempted to allay the fears of the times by all of those approaches. Berry observes the inherent interconnectedness of all life that approaches a systems perspective. In his essay, The Body and the Earth, he argues that our individual, embodied lives are intertwined with one another and the world. He says, "But these things that appear to be distinct are nevertheless caught in a network of mutual dependence and influence that is the substantiation of their unity. Body, soul, or mind or spirit," he says, "community and world are all susceptible to each other's influence, and they are all conductors of each other's influence. The body is damaged by the bewilderment of the spirit. It conducts the influence of that bewilderment into the earth conducts it into the community, and so on. If a farmer fails to understand what health is, his farm becomes unhealthy. It produces unhealthy food, which damages the health of the community. But this is a network, a spherical network, by which each part is connected to every other part. The farmer is part of the community, and so it is impossible to say exactly where the trouble began as it is to say where it will end. The influences go backward and forward, up and down, round and round, and compounding and branching as they go. All that is certain is that an error introduced anywhere into the network ramifies beyond the scope of the prediction. Consequences occur all over the place, and each consequence breeds further consequences." Like Bowen, Berry observes the intricate systemic connection that includes all human beings as well as the earth and all its inhabitants. J. Matthew Bonzo and Michael Stevens describe Berry's perspective as a kind of hierarchy that proceeds from wilderness to soil to food to body to marriage to household to community. Health or wholeness at the top of the hierarchy requires health further down. Healthy human communities are not possible when unhealthy soil produces unhealthy food and feeds unhealthy bodies. The human disconnection with nature at the level of wilderness and soil is expressed in our disconnection with our food, our bodies, and one another. Barry, like Bowen, recognizes the disharmony between human beings and nature as an issue at the heart of society. Barry describes our violence toward nature as what peacetime acts of aggression, in which we are at war not against foreign enemies, but against the world itself, and consequently against our own existence. Nature, he warns, is, quote, necessarily a party to all our enterprises, and, quote, she imposes conditions of her own. He argues that nature is plainly saying to us, if you put the fates of communities or cities or regions or ecosystems at risk in a single ship or factory or power plant, then I will furnish the drunk or the fool or the imbecile who will make the necessary small mistake. Barry locates the disharmony between nature, with nature, primarily in the consequences of modern industrialization and an economy driven by growth and consumption that lacks any sense of appropriate scale, that wields too much power with too little knowledge. In his fiction and poetry, as well as in his essays, Barry provides litanies of such destructive consequences, including the demise of rural communities and local economies, the pervasiveness of racism, economic injustice, the denigration of the value of good work, the dislocation of human families, and the failure of human systems such as education and government. At the heart of the issue, Barry identifies a mentality of greed and exploitation. He says, the mentality that exploits and destroys the natural environment is the same that abuses racial and economic minorities, that imposes on young men the tyranny of the military draft, that makes war against peasants and women and children with the indifference of technology. The mentality that destroys a watershed and then panics at the threat of flood is the same mentality that gives institutionalized insult to black people and then panics at the prospect of race riots. It is the same mentality that can mount deliberate warfare against a civilian population and then express moral shock at the logical consequences of such warfare in My Lai. We would be fools to believe, he says, that we could solve any of these problems without solving the others. Our disintegration from the entire community of nature and our exploitive and greedy approach to the world have their consequences in the disintegration of family life, human life, and communities. They're connected. Murray Bowen contemplated the future of the regression identified at the end of the 20th century, and he wrote, I believe man is moving into a crisis of unparalleled proportions, that the crisis will be different from those he has faced before, and that they will come with increasing frequency for several decades, and that he will go as far as he can in dealing symptomatically with each crisis, and that a final major crisis will come as soon as the middle of the next century. The type of man who survives that will be one who can live in better harmony with nature. This prediction is based on knowledge about the nature of man as an instinctual being and on stretching existing thinking as far as it can go. There are many questions about what man can do in his environmental crisis. The thesis here is he might modify his future course if he can gain some control over his reaction to anxiety and his instinctual emotional reactiveness and begin taking constructive action based on his fund of knowledge and on logical thinking. In Bowen's thinking, the question of whether human beings can find our way out of the chaos of the regression may depend in part on how well we find a way to restore harmony to our relationship there. When Wendell thinks about the possibilities beyond the current chaos, he advocates something similar but perhaps a bit more concrete. Barry is sometimes accused of being merely naive, merely romantic, nostalgic, or a Luddite. The fictional community, Port William, Kentucky, the setting for all his novels and short stories, is sometimes dismissed as an idyllic and remembered past that never truly existed. These critiques may be missing Barry's point. Although Barry himself attempts to live as near as possible to the ideas he's been espousing since the 1970s, he also acknowledges regretfully his own complicity in the changes brought on by industrialization. He does not own a computer or a television set, but he confesses, quote, his bondage to the automobile industry and the energy companies, which he says have nothing to commend them other than our dependence on them. He relies on airplanes when necessary, which he says, quote, have nothing to recommend them but speed. They are inconvenient, uncomfortable, undependable, ugly, stinky, and scary. He cuts his own wood with a chainsaw, which he says, quote, has nothing to recommend it but speed and has all the faults of an airplane except it does not fly. But he attempts and challenges others to attempt to draw a line in our lives where it is not easily drawn, to give up things that we have learned in only a few years to need. Barry says, quote, I'm not without hope. I knew a man who, in the age of chainsaws, went right on cutting his own wood with a handsaw and an axe. He was a healthier and saner man than I am. I shall let his memory trouble my thoughts. In other words, he's not calling readers to abandon technology and retire to rural communes. Barry doesn't suggest such simplistic answers. Rather, he thinks in terms of individual people in specific places, considering well their own habits of life and integrating in their behavior their beliefs and values. Bonzo and Stevens put it, it is a call stressing an integrity between the values we confess and the lives we embody. Barry's fictional community of Port William is not intended to be a mere nostalgic destination or romanticized agrarian existence. Rather, it offers a vision of what human life could look like, well-lived and well-connected with nature and with one another. The community of Port William itself, some have argued, is the protagonist in all his works. In his narratives of Port William and its membership, Barry provides an imaginative way forward in the chaotic and disintegrating world that he observes. Beyond the vision of Port William, Barry's wisdom is more concrete. He does not anticipate that we all evacuate the cities and live in the country, but he does call for a more responsible way of living, less consumptive, less preoccupied with technology, more focused on the priority of human relationships, and more directly connected to the wilderness, the soil, and our food. This kind of urban agrarianism calls for thoughtful lifestyle changes that have the potential to restore greater harmony between us and the natural world. Perhaps the most direct contact we have with nature is through the food that sustains us. To live, Barry said, we must daily break the body and shed the blood of creation. When we do this knowingly, lovingly, skillfully, reverently, it is a sacrament. When we do it ignorantly, greedily, clumsily, destructively, it is a desecration. In such desecration, we condemn ourselves to spiritual and moral blindness and others to want. A more mindful approach to the daily experience of nourishing our own bodies and minds is a pivotal entree into greater harmony with our common home and our relationship to others who share the home with us, human and otherwise. Barry writes, a significant part of the pleasure of eating is one's accurate consciousness of the lives and the world from which the food comes. He suggests increasing the pleasure of eating in a way that connects us more deeply with nature. Here are some of his suggestions. Participate in food production to the extent you can. He said if you can just grow a pepper in your windowsill, that's an improvement of buying it at H-E-B or Kroger. Prepare your own food. Learn the origins of the food you buy and buy the food produced closest to your home. Whenever possible, deal directly with a local farmer. Learn in self-defense as much as you can of the economy and technology of industrial food production. Learn what is involved in the best farming and gardening practices. Learn as much as you can by direct observation and experience, if possible, of the life histories of the food species you consume. Besides a more mindful approach to our meals, Barry believes that cultivating genuine affection for the world about us leads to a more active caring for it. We take care of that for which we have affection. Taking a phrase from E.M. Forster's novel, Howard's Inn, Barry titled his Jefferson Lecture for the NEH in 2012, It All Turns on Affection. By affection, he means a love, appreciation for, a commitment to care for one's place in the world. This is how he imagines the earth being best stewarded by humans, kind of like earth as a small family farm. He saw such affection sustaining the land as small farms were passed on within a family from one generation to another, along with the necessary knowledge of how to care for it so that it might be able to sustain life for that family well into the future. He saw sustainable farming and care for the land diminish as industrialized agriculture took the place of family farms, and the soil became a mere natural resource to be tapped without affection by operators of large modernized agribusinesses. The restoration of affection for our place on earth may be another route toward living in greater harmony with nature. This is more of a challenge when we live in a world surrounded by steel, concrete, glass, and asphalt. Bothering to learn the names of the trees and plants that adorn our neighborhoods could even be a starting place. We do not have affection for that which we do not know. Keeping the place clean, being careful of our use of water, recycling when we can. These are small steps, but if taken intentionally, carefully, affectionately, they can remind us and cause us to remember our connection to the earth. Barry himself is engaged in civil disobedience in support of local issues affecting his region, another expression of affection for the place. Barry addresses another theme frequently, the necessity of wilderness in our lives. The development of interstate highway systems and fast automobiles has turned wilderness into mere scenery for many of us. Barry's not interested in us viewing scenic bypasses and landscapes, but he's interested in humans finding time to enter the wilderness and notice it. The forest, he said, grew here in its own time, and so I will live, suffer, and rejoice and die in my own time. It is in the wilderness we learn humility. We humans are less important than we imagined. The wild things that live in the wilderness, when observed, actually have very domestic lives. They mate, build homes, rear their young, face dangers, find food, find a means of surviving challenges. We learn that in the wilderness. And in learning that, we may find a harmony between nature and us restored a bit. I would be doing Barry a disservice if I cited his essays and alluded to his fiction without allowing the poet to speak. One of his best-known poems he titled The Peace of Wild Things. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things and do not tax their life with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. We do well to consider what a thoughtful, responsible citizenship in our common home might look like, what it might mean for us to live, as Bowen put it, in greater harmony with nature. Barry rejects the abstract language of the environment or saving the planet or ending poverty. Such abstract descriptions, he argues, keep the issues at arm's length. He contends the problems ultimately are local problems. He says the question must be addressed, therefore, is not how to care for the planet, but how to care for each of the planet's millions of human and natural neighborhoods, each of its millions of small pieces and parcels of land, each of which is different from all the others. Our understandable wish to preserve the planet must somehow be reduced to the scale of our competence. This is the wish to preserve all of its humble households and neighborhoods.